Continuing, Pauline Kael, the critic, wore cowboy boots. An interview by Marc Smirnoff from 1992. Question: what kind of effect have VCRs had on Hollywood? Kael: you simply don't get the full picture, and you don't get the size and intensity. You lose all the detail if you look at a movie that is particularly visual, a movie by a great film director on a big screen, and then look at it on television. You almost want to weep because it's just no longer the great movie you saw. What you're getting is essentially the narrative and the acting, but you're losing almost everything else, and you're losing the emotional resonances which come from the full image. It's heartbreaking to think of the work of the greatest directors being known by people only from television images. On the other hand, I've exposed my grandson to the early films on VCR because that's the only way he's going to see them. I didn't want him to feel that Home Alone was the only kind of movie there was, so he has seen Buster Keaton and the Sabu version of The Thief of Baghdad and The Crimson Pirate, the Burt Lancaster film, and dozens of adventure classics and early comedies. The only way I could make it possible for him to see them was on a VCR. So it's better than nothing. It's certainly better than nothing. But the tragedy is that people aren't going to theaters often when a terrific movie opens, like, say, Enemies or The Unbearable Lightness of Being, because they feel they'll catch up with it on VCR later. If your standard of a good movie is, say, The Terminator, there's no particular reason to see it on a big screen. You can get the same kind of dumb kicks at home and have a beer with your friends at the same time. But this may change. You can't be too long in the face about it. Things may change in a couple of years. A couple of big movies may make the difference. You can't tell in a popular art form. Things change very quickly. I could never have predicted that the audiences who seemed so hip in the 70s would accept the kind of movies they accepted in the 80s. It still bewilders me that people who really enjoyed the Godfather movies and Brian De Palma's Dressed to Kill and a lot of very hip movies by Altman could then accept what they accepted later on. I didn't think that there was a way the culture could go back. We've had a strange cultural regression, and it's dumbfounding. I could not have believed that people would accept the Gulf War the way it was accepted, and the same kind of thing has happened to the movies. Question: where do you find the MTV influence on movies? Kael: it's in movie editing a lot, in showing off. It's in sort of empty cuts. MTV doesn't have much to offer movies, but you do see a lot of fast cutting in movies, as if they were afraid of boring the MTV generation. But the MTV generation, I think, is bored by MTV. Question: most soundtracks sound hideous. What's wrong with them? Kael: you mean because they're too loud and vulgar, and the music is appalling? Well, the music is used to pad out the meaning of the movie, and it's used to goose up the movie, to give it a kick that it didn't have. Every once in a while you'll get an interesting soundtrack. There have been a couple in recent years. The soundtrack was quite marvelous on Altman's Vincent and Theo, and there was a fascinating soundtrack by Peter Gabriel for Scorsese's Christ movie. These are about the only two really interesting soundtracks I can think of. That's pretty incredible, isn't it? Godard did wonderful work with sound, and it looked as if he was going to revolutionize the way people treated sound in movies, and now it's going back to the most conventional kind of padded-out stuff. Now they're not even doing rock very much, now that it's an attempt to reprise the old banal orchestra violin score in the big emotional moment. It's really an insult to the audience, but the audience basically doesn't know it's insulted. I shouldn't put it that way. Let me put it, the audience may even enjoy being insulted. Question: the Star Wars soundtrack set us back. Kael: Star Wars set us back in a lot of ways. Even though I thought the second film in the trilogy was really quite good, as a commercial phenomenon it set us back. And the Indiana Jones movie added to that, even though I like the second one of that series also. But what they represented in terms of movie making was that the studios realized that the audiences didn't mind being treated like kids at a Saturday afternoon cereal. Question: As a fan of musicals, how do you view the state of movie musicals? What was the last good one? Kael. It's an almost non-existent genre now. I'd say the last really spectacular musical is the MGM Pennies from Heaven. I couldn't believe it when I saw the reviews panning that movie. It's very sad that Herbert Ross, having done that amazing movie, should have gone back to making stuff like Steel Magnolias and made money at it, when he failed commercially with Pennies from Heaven. It is hard to know how people can do things that are ambitious or large-spirited when their worst works succeed and their best work fails. But there have been movies that you couldn't really call musicals, like The Rose, the Bette Midler film. There have been movies that used a lot of music, and some of them have been pretty good, but it has not been a popular form. I can't believe it in some ways. I can't believe Aretha Franklin was used so sparingly. Except for the Blues Brothers, she never really got a chance to show on screen what she could do. There have been so many tremendous performers who just haven't had a chance to be part of a great musical conception. Question. What about James Brown in a musical? Kael. Oh, sure, it seems unbelievable that a great American art form that seemed to have every opportunity to expand and to adopt with the times got lost and buried. The whole age of rock is not represented by a single important movie. Question. I'm quite interested in your 5 months of employment in Hollywood in 1979. Kael. Well, it actually went very well. I had a very good time. The papers were determined to make it sound, and the magazines were determined to make it sound, as if it had been a terrible blow-up, and yet there was nothing of the kind. Newsweek printed an item saying that after a couple of weeks or something, I had managed to alienate everyone in Hollywood. And that item came out before I had started, because when I left the New Yorker, I had a commitment to go to the hospital to have some minor surgery. So before I got started, they had printed that I had been this incredible fiasco, but that's sort of, par. There's a great deal of hostility towards critics in general, and towards a woman critic in particular, and an independent-minded one, and so you read an awful lot of stuff about yourself that isn't true. Question. What exactly was your position? Kael. It was just executive consultant, and it was a very flexible position. And I talked to anybody who stopped by and wanted to talk to me, or any executive who wanted to discuss some of his decisions. An awful lot of the time in Hollywood was spent mulling over the same things, because you talk to people, and 2 days later they come back and talk over the same problem, and I got very impatient. It's hard not to show it. It's hard to keep your mind open enough to consider the problems as those people face them. I was offered other positions afterward, but I really wanted out. I didn't want to go on in a different capacity because writing is really, if you grew up as I did, the highest thing you could do, and so the jobs where you make money or wield executive decisions don't compare to the freedom of writing. It's the freedom that's fun. Question. I'm interested in that whole term because when you think of your exalted position at the time, and Kael, exalted is putting it kind of strong. Question. Well, as being the most important voice in movie criticism, there is a lot of significance in your trading movie reviews for movie making. Kael. Well, remember, I did have a good position in that everyone in L.A. was incredibly nice to me, and they either respected me, or feared I was really there to write something nasty about them, which I would not have done. What Warren Beatty felt when he suggested the position was that what I did in my reviews in pointing out where a movie went wrong, I should be able to do before the movie was made, so I should be very valuable in the industry. I think to some degree there was something to that, but really the only thing that went wrong was I missed writing. I loved writing, and I loved writing about movies, and I felt, at the time I was turning 60, that maybe I was written out and that I was saying the same thing over and over again. But after I was there a few months, and I read the reviews of other critics, I began to sort of hit the ceiling because people were panning movies that I saw merit in, and they were panning performances that I thought were wonderful. I missed having my voice. No one was saying the things I wanted to say, and so I arranged to go back to the New Yorker. I went back with sort of a renewed head of steam because I knew I really had more to say. I think I did some of my best work during those 10 years after returning from Hollywood. I know that people who review me often say that my first book, I Lost It at the Movies, is my best work. I think they say that because it had a more original impact on them. I think my sensibility was fresher to them, but I think I knew more about movies in these last years. And I think I'm a better writer than I was then. I think some of the writing in the last couple of years, I'm not ashamed of. I don't feel I fell apart too much. There are places over the years where I think I got too wordy and too descriptive, maybe, but it's partly in order to change. As a critic, as you get older, you can't write the way you did. You have to find new approaches to movies. You can't tackle them the same way, and so you try to look at them differently and try to write with a different voice sometimes. You're trying not to be a repetitive drag, and so I can understand if they like the early work, which was more Hatchet-like. But I think there's more understanding of the movie process in the later work. Oddly enough, when I retired earlier this year, I had the same reaction I had in '79 of, God, nobody's saying the things I want to say. It's driving me crazy, particularly when they pan things that I feel are good. But I know now I can't return. I'm not physically strong enough to go on with going into New York and waiting in lines and going to see the movies. So it's tough. But you have to recognize that you've reached a point. If I haven't said it now, I can't say it. But I still see movies and I think, why hasn't somebody pointed out this marvelous performance in the corner of this movie? Question. Some people maintain that absolute power corrupts. In many ways, at least as a link between Hollywood and the audience, you are absolutely the most powerful voice in movie land. Of your Hollywood months, you said, people treated me as if I were a high priestess. It must have been hard, Kael. You say very abrupt four-letter words when they do. You have to cut through that crap. I'm pretty good at being rude and cutting through it, using rude language, because I don't like being fawned on. I'm not built for people to fawn over, as they discover after a while. Question. But you were in a position where people did fawn over you all the time, Kael. Some did, but you can cut through that. Question. Was it hard? Kael. You can reveal that you're a person, not an eminence, and you know I never took to wearing capes or turbans. Question. Was it a struggle ever? I would just think hearing praise over and over has got to be, Kael. You hear a lot of ugliness, too. You know, there are people who are very hostile, and that gets through to you, too. Any number of male friends of mine have had to defend me against guys who wanted to beat me up, and in one case, a woman who wanted to. Question. Did you have any preconceptions about working in Hollywood that materialized into reality? Kael. Oh, I knew so much about it, I'd read so much and heard so much over the years. I felt a freedom in not having deadlines. I could stay up half the night talking to people, which was fun because I'm a very gregarious person. And when you're writing to deadline every week, you don't have much time to socialize. No, it wasn't bad. I enjoyed it. But I enjoyed writing more. I felt as if I wasn't using my full brain. Question. Did you enjoy going on movie sets and watching movies being made? Kael. I've only done that a very few times. It's excruciatingly boring because they do the same thing over and over again, and mostly you're standing around waiting for the lighting to be arranged for the next shot. No, I really only did it for any length of time when I was doing the piece, The Making of the Group, and it's very boring. I mean, I don't know who has the patience to stand around movie sets. It's fun to drop in and see what the locations are like and talk to the people briefly, but the director's always busy as hell. Question. A movie I saw a few times because I liked it was David Lynch's Elephant Man. I understand you urged the right people to help get it made. Kael. I did. They had passed on it. They had turned it down. I had never met David Lynch, and I had no connection with the movie, but I had read the script. I did not think it was a particularly good script, but I thought the idea was such a good idea for David Lynch. I did know his earlier work, and I urged them to make the movie, to commit some money to it. I was very excited when I saw the movie because I felt that Lynch had overcome the weaknesses of the script. I was very sad that more reviewers didn't respond to what went on in that movie, because I thought the kind of Victorian sensibility that he brought to it was fascinating. I think people wanted to see it as simple sentimentality, whereas I think it had a kind of Dickensian grandeur. Question. I find it hard to picture you attending the Academy Awards, but, Kael, I've never been there, so your instincts were right. Question. They always award and neglect the wrong movies. Kael. Almost always. Sometimes there's nothing to give it to. They tend to go for certain kinds of pictures and certain people, and others are just systematically neglected. I've rarely agreed with the choices, but you get used to that. It's like books on the bestsellers list. When are the books you really like up there? Question. How did your obsession with movies begin? Kael. I don't really think it's an obsession. I know it seems that way, because people have made it sound that way. But I was just as interested really in books and theater and music and painting. I mean, I was almost equally interested in all the arts. Somehow I think that I was able to write on movies in a way that perhaps I couldn't write on other things, because all the arts come into play. I don't think it's really that I had that much of a stronger involvement in them than a lot of other people do. But somehow, because I have been writing about them most of my life, it may seem like an obsession. Question. You report that after college you wrote plays fairly extensively for a number of years. Did you ever try to write a screenplay? Kael. I was just never drawn to it as much. I really got into criticism fairly early, and once I'd gotten into criticism I realized I could say what I wanted to say. I can make contact with people more directly that way. I'm too direct to be a screenwriter. I would be expressing myself rather than developing character. Question. So even out of experiment's sake, you never tried since you began reviewing a story or a screenplay? Kael. I've played with it a couple of times, but I really love criticism, and I think it's an honorable estate. For at least 30 years, people said to me, why don't you do something besides criticism? As if criticism was something inferior. I think they're wrong, and I think I can be more expressive as a critic than in other forms. I don't think people realize how much they enjoy reading criticism. I think people take it for granted because there are columns in the papers every day. Question. It is said that you never had to see a movie twice before writing about it. This is amazing because your reviews, by dint of their all-inclusiveness, always seem to be the result of more than one viewing. Did you ever have to see a movie twice to get a handle on it? Kael. No, not to get a handle on it, but a couple of times I've gone to see a movie again because I wanted to be sure I was quoting a line accurately or was placing a bit of business in the right scene. I went to see Godfather 2 after I'd turned in my copy, and it was in type, just to make sure there were no inaccuracies in it. I went to see Casualties of War after it was set up in type for the same reason, and at Nashville I saw 2 nights in a row as a fluke. Most of the time once is enough. I've got no great desire to see a movie again. Question. Well, when you saw those 3 movies a second time, did you pick up anything you had missed in your first viewing? Kael. I wish I could be humble and say, oh, many things. Let's leave it at that. Question. How should a person go about educating himself about movies? Kael. Oh, God, if he has to go about educating himself, forget it. I think that popular culture is something you pick up. It seeps into you. It's in the environment. I've heard of people getting jobs as movie critics and then watching 10 classic movies to get educated in movies. The whole thought makes me want to throw darts at them. If you haven't picked up an education in movies from what's available in your area, from television and from VCRs, what's the point? You can never catch up. Sure, you can pick out some of the great ones to go see, but that's not the same thing as seeing what the great ones spring out of, which is all the crap. Part of getting to know movies is sorting out the great ones from the crap for yourself, seeing all those lousy Warner Brothers movies, out of which the really good ones came, and there's no way you can educate yourself in that. Question. I've heard a few people say that they have stopped reading you because you have made them feel stupid at times for liking something they shouldn't. Have you ever? Kael. Tough. Question. I take it then that you never tried to tone down your criticism. Kael. Sometimes simple humanity makes you do so. Oh, sure, there are times when I'm not nearly as rough on a performance as I feel because it's just cruel. I mean, the person can't help being incompetent. There are a lot of actors or a lot of writers and directors who are just very bad, and if you pan them once, that seems to be enough. I try not to pan the same person over and over. If I've panned somebody's work very harshly and then see another movie that's lousy in the same way, I don't review it, because it's ugly to pan somebody over and over again. It's vicious. What can you do? Most of these people can't help it. It's much more to the point to try to spot who has talent in the movies than who doesn't. Question. Has a critic of your work ever caused you to change? Kael. It's hard to change. I've tried different things because of objections. Once a reviewer claimed I used the I form exclusively, and so I didn't use the I form for a solid year, and the only person who noticed was a friend of mine who said, "Your work has become impersonal lately." But he didn't notice why, and nobody else noticed either. I thought he's right, it is becoming impersonal. It's losing something that was valuable there. So I went back to the I form. A lot of people have objected to my using the you form, and they don't seem to realize it's a simple way of trying to be an American and not being a Britisher and saying, "One thinks that." I hate the Anglicisms and that have crept into critical writing. I loathe that one that you read all the time. You think, who is that goddamn one? And so I try to write the way Americans talk, and they use you very flexibly. And so I use it, even though I get rapped for it all the time. I'd say among the things I get rapped for, the most that's probably number one, and number two is my praise of Brian De Palma. Question. We say y'all. Kael. Sure, that's a way from getting away from one, also. Y'all is sort of nice. It has a soft, easy quality. One formalizes everything. Question. Is there a service in warning people away from vile movies? Kael. Normally, what I'm interested in writing about are the movies that I don't think get the praise that they deserve. But I do think it's important to use the destructive function of criticism. Sure, and I think that the thing is, if people aren't warned off certain movies, they're not going to trust you on certain good ones. But I'd like to have gotten more people to go to see a few oddball pictures that have opened. I'd love to have written about Hearts of Darkness. I really felt very strongly about that, but I thought if I start writing about something, I'll finish myself off in no time. Question. There's a constant argument going on whether you should see the movie first or read the book first. Kael. Well, I don't think there's any question but that you should read the book first because the movie fixes its images in your mind so that you couldn't read the book afterwards without seeing it in the movie's terms. It would wreck a great book, as in the case of The Rainbow by D.H. Lawrence. It would be heartbreaking to read it in terms of the actress, Sammy Davis, who played the leading role, because she was totally inadequate to it, and you would never see the dimensions of the character on the page. In any kind of honor to the book of a great writer, you must read the book first because the movie is almost inevitably going to diminish the material. Question. How would you describe The New Yorker? Kael. I think it has been the best literary magazine in the country, and I think most writers recognize that, but that doesn't mean it's anywhere near as good as it should be. It has been, though liberal, extremely conventional in many ways, and I think my column shocked regular New Yorker readers. The first few years I got very hostile responses from the readers, and a lot of the staff, because the writing was colloquial and direct and deliberately so, and deliberately crude in many ways. I felt the only way of being honest and writing about a popular form like movies was to try to write about them in the terms in which we actually experienced them, instead of using the language of the classroom, which was more commonplace in film reviews then. In The New Yorker, they expected a more genteel treatment and more respect for foreign films. And of course, the first movie I reviewed for it was Bonnie and Clyde, and that was sort of the opening shot of the new generation in movies. I had written the Bonnie and Clyde piece for the New Republic, where I was working at the time, and they had refused to print it. The arts editor of the magazine actually quit in disgust when the publisher refused to print the Bonnie and Clyde piece. He was deeply upset because he loved it and felt something new was happening in criticism, and he just couldn't stand the publisher saying no to him. So I wasn't alone, at least. And I had built up a certain following by then. I had been writing for various magazines for some time, but that piece, coming out of the New Yorker, was a jolt to a lot of New Yorker staff people as well as readers. I don't think you would know the atmosphere of the times. The movie had been panned as an insult to the audience, as bloody and offensive, by just about every major critic in the country. And so the praise of it coming out in the New Yorker was quite a shock to people. And I do have a fairly strong voice. It's not a timid voice, and that, coming from a woman in particular, added to the shock, so that I remember getting a letter from an eminent New Yorker writer suggesting that I was trampling through the pages of the magazine with cowboy boots covered with dung, and that I should move on out with my cowboy boots. William Shawn showed a lot of courage in sticking by me in those early years, because I would get letters all the time saying, "Why don't you get a job on a sports page and learn to write?" People were more used to movies being treated in a magazine like The New Yorker as something a gentleman might condescend to now and then, but wouldn't take very seriously. I felt that the truth of how we respond to movies, and the sexual aspects of movies, were far more important responses than critics wanted to acknowledge, and so all that came out in the reviews too. But once people started getting used to me, the mail started changing. But I got angry responses whenever I panned anything that was liberal in intention, or virtuous, or European. European films have a respectability in this country that is way out of proportion to their merit. Question: But the New York Times likes every European movie. Kael: Over the years, I've disagreed with so many of my colleagues that the public often gets confused, particularly when the New Yorker and the New York Times are so distant from each other. The New York Times shows more taste than most newspapers in the country, and people, in the East in particular, want to regard it as some sort of exemplar of culture. And I think in general, its critical press is really fourth-rate, and in movies it has not been a shining example of what it might be. The Sunday paper covers just about every foreign film as if it were an important cultural entity, and people read all the praise of these incredibly terrible movies and go see the movies and can't disagree with the New York Times, and so it's a shock to them to pick up the New Yorker and find the movie panned, and so you have to deal with that over the years. Question: You said the New Yorker is not as good as it could be. What do you think it needs to be better? Kael: I think a certain Anglophilia crept into it very early on, when it was founded, really. It started out with a sort of English tone and a kind of elite, sophisticated Manhattan tone, which was fake English. Even though it became political and much more democratic, and took very useful political stands during the Vietnam War years, it never got rid of that polite English tone. And it's too much a magazine that seems directed toward an educated reader. It never seems to invite people in. It's a magazine that could stand a little dose of multiculturalism in the fullest sense of that. It needs to be more open, less of the same circle of short story writers endlessly repeated. You get tired of the same words, all those long words Updike uses. It's great to have Updike, but they should have a lot of people for whom words don't multiply so easily. Question: I have trouble with the New Yorker ignoring the crime in the city. Kael: That's part of the problem. It's not been very realistic about what went on in the city. It's as if it wanted to maintain a sort of elite tone even when the city had deteriorated, and that tone was no longer in any way relevant to the city. Question: In almost every one of your books, you give thanks to William Shawn. How would you describe him as a person and as an editor? Kael: Well, he gave me a shot at something. He knew I was trying to do something different, and he gave me a chance at it. I'm not sure that any other editor would have stuck by me the way he did. and he was a wonderful editor in the sense that you knew he wanted you to write your best. He was always interested in what I was saying, and if he liked a piece particularly, and didn't have a chance to tell me so at the office, he would call me at night. He might call at midnight to argue about a comma, and I mean, it seems absurd, it is absurd. And yet you can't help loving and respecting someone who cares that much about the magazine, and wants your writing to be as clear as possible. He made me clarify my thinking simply by his devotion to meaning, and he didn't care how long something ran. Sometimes I think he was wrong. There were a few times when I wanted to trim what I'd turned in, and he said, no, he thought it was better at the full length. I'm not sure he was right, but the very fact that he felt that a writer had a natural phrasing and a natural length, and that a subject could be treated at a natural length, that you didn't have to cram everything into a half column, gave you a sense that what you were doing mattered. That's a very unusual editor, especially in New York, in a glossy magazine, on a weekly schedule. Question. When the New Yorker was sold, you were quoted as saying, what could endanger the tradition of editorial integrity at the New Yorker, and would probably destroy the magazine, would be the appointment of an editor from the outside to succeed William Shawn. Of course, that is precisely what happened. William Shawn was ousted, and Robert Gottlieb, an outsider, was put in. How has the magazine fared? Kael. I think what I said was fundamentally true. I think the magazine has changed in some ways. Some for the better, but a lot for the not-so-good. I do think certain traditions have been broken down. There's an awful lot of sloppiness in the writing in the front of the magazine, in the goings-on section. A lot of careless writing that sounds like advertising copy. And I don't think the critical departments have fared very well. I think in some ways the fiction may have improved. Gottlieb has more open taste than Shawn did, and is much less restrictive about the language and theme, and that has been good for the magazine. But I think, in general, he has hired poorly in the critical departments. There are still wonderful people. There's Arlene Croce, who is simply a magnificent writer, and there are many fine writers who are posted in spots around the world and do wonderful writing. But I think the weekly critical columns are really part of the lifeblood of the magazine, and when those become mediocre, the magazine is in trouble. You don't open the various critical columns now with the excitement that you should. He has not hired people, say, of the stature of Harold Rosenberg, or some of the others who held those posts. I find myself reading the critical departments with disbelief often. Shawn read very widely, periodicals and books, and tried to get the best person in the world for any kind of opening he had. I don't think Gottlieb puts the same kind of effort and care into his selection of people. The worst failure, I think, of Gottlieb's regime is that the book department is so bad. Everyone assumed that coming out of publishing, he would bring life to the book section, and it's deathly. It's so rare to read a review that you really want to go all the way through, or to read a new writer, read a new critical approach, and feel, God, he's got somebody hot on this. You just don't feel any heat in the book section, and that could be an important part of the magazine. There's an incredible staff of people, and having seen their devotion and their intelligence and what they want to do, I'm often disappointed they don't get a chance to get at livelier subjects in the talk of the town. The title of it is an embarrassment. What's in it is so rarely the talk of any town. Question. Do you think Mr. Gottlieb has tried to maintain the tradition? The look, at least, has not undergone too many changes. Kael. I think the covers are better, not necessarily aesthetically, but they have a little more vitality. They'd gotten to the point where you couldn't tell one week's from the last week's. I do think Gottlieb has opened the atmosphere some. I just don't think he is as dedicated as Shawn was. I think he has other things in his life besides the magazine. He isn't thinking about it all the time, and reading and seeing if there is a new voice somewhere that he should go after. That was the great thing about Shawn, that he would go after new voices. Let me put it this way. I think Gottlieb wants to put out the best magazine he can. I'm not always sure he's as daring in what he prints as he might be, and that holds particularly in the book section. There are old fogey voices in the book section much too often. Question. You are a TV news junkie. Isn't it kind of depressing to see the way politicians or candidates get away with so much? Kael. Yeah, but it's fascinating to see what they get away with and how much. I don't understand people who say, there's no point in reading newspapers because they all lie. Teenagers say that, or there's no point in watching the news. They don't tell you the whole truth. That seems to assume that you can't piece anything together or learn anything, and of course you can. Question. Are you working on anything now? Kael. I'm making notes on something. There's been a lot of stuff to clean up. I was behind on correspondence. I hate not answering things promptly, but things have piled up on me, and a lot of mail has come in, so I'm behind on that. I feel that I should clean up the mail before I sit down to write, which is silly. I'll never clean it up. There are a couple of subjects that I want to write about, but I don't want to talk them to death before I write about them. The other thing is I don't have the energy I used to have. I used to be able to count on just being able to go all night and day. Sometimes I wouldn't see the movie I wanted to write about until the night before my deadline at the magazine, but I knew I could stay up all night and write the piece, and I'd be in the clear. I just can't count on energy like that anymore. Question. Have you cut back on going to movies since your retirement? Kael. Yeah, there are a lot of stinkers. At least I assume they're stinkers on the basis of what they're about and who's made them, that I figure I'll wait for and watch on TV or on HBO. But generally, when they turn up, they're such stinkers that I don't have the interest in watching them on HBO anyway. Question. Sounds like a sort of retirement gift? Kael. Yeah, it is a gift. If you have any brains at all, you can't watch the mediocre movies all your life. I mean, there has to be something else going on in your head. There are a lot of things I want to do. It's more fun to be with people than to watch some stinky movie. Question. Is a person lucky to be a movie critic? Kael. It really is a wonderfully exciting field to write about when the movies are good. When they're not so good, it's to despair. The really bad movies you can write about with some passion and anger. It's the mediocre ones that wear you down. They're disgusting to write about because you can feel yourself slipping into the same mediocrity and stupidity. And you feel you're boring the readers and yourself. When you start falling asleep while you're writing a review, you know how dull the movie is. The danger for criticism is that people will want to become critics in order to become television celebrities rather than enjoying the pleasure of writing and the excitement of trying to define and describe what you've seen. Question. Do you miss writing reviews? Kael. Yes, but I know I've got to adjust to it. That's part of adapting to getting older. You've got to recognize that the time for certain things has passed. And I'm not an idiot. I know I would not write at my best if I went on. You start repeating yourself. You write the same phrase, you write the same descriptions. I've already had the problem of working on a paragraph that I thought was pretty good and looking up what I said about that director's work the last time I wrote about him and finding out it was almost exactly the same paragraph. Well, it's time to quit. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe and comment. And that's all. For the rest of the day, do what you want.